The microwave clock reads 2:14 a.m. The blue light cuts across the granite island, the only thing awake in a house that breathes with the heavy, rhythmic sleep of my husband and children upstairs. My phone sits face up on the counter. The screen has gone dark, but the message burned into the pixels is still there, glowing behind the black glass. My hands are shaking. Not a tremble, but a violent, structural vibration that travels up my wrists. I look down at my left hand. The pale band of skin where my wedding ring sat 5 minutes ago feels raw, exposed to the cool air. That ring has been there for 15 years. Taking it off didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a reflex. In the span of reading one sentence, the safety of the last decade has evaporated. To understand why that text shattered me, you have to understand the architecture it hit. My life isn't just stable, it's fortified. I work in biotech, a field where variables are controlled, contaminants are isolated, and outcomes are predicted within a margin of error so small it's practically invisible. I spent my 20s and 30s applying that same rigorous methodology to my own existence. I curated a life that was immune to chaos. Look at this kitchen. It's a masterpiece of greige, that safe, expensive blend of gray and beige that signals you've made it. The countertops are quartz, non-porous, easy to clean. The floors are heated. Everything is seamless. There is no friction here. For years, I told myself that the absence of friction was the definition of happiness. I thought peace meant silence. My marriage to Marcus operates with the same efficiency as the lab. We are excellent partners. We manage the logistics of 2 careers, 2 teenagers, and a mortgage with the precision of a well-oiled merger. Tuesday is pasta night, Thursday is finance review, Saturday is date night, which usually means a mid-range dinner where we discuss the kids' SAT prep or the renovation of the guest bath. It's pleasant. It's polite. It's a partnership built on shared assets and mutual respect. But there is no heat. I remember the day I got promoted to lead researcher. I came home, vibrating with the news, the adrenaline of a breakthrough coursing through me. Marcus kissed my cheek, poured me a glass of Chardonnay, and said, "That's sensible. It's good for the pension." He wasn't wrong. It was sensible. But I remember standing in the shower that night, the hot water unable to warm the sudden, cold realization that I was living inside a vacuum. I moved through my days like a diver at deep pressure, functioning, breathing, but everything was muffled. I drove my Audi to the office. I oversaw clinical trials. I approved protocols. I drove home. I smiled at dinner. I slept. It was a loop, a perfect, sterile circle. I felt like I was asleep, or maybe suspended in that gel we use for cultures, held in place, perfectly preserved, but not actually growing. When Marcus touches me, it's with the familiar, dry weight of habit. A hand on the shoulder as he passes, a peck on the lips that feels like a stamp of approval rather than a request. There is no moisture in it, no grip. It's the touch of someone who knows exactly where you are and has no fear that you'll ever move. I walked through the corridors of my office building, the fluorescent lights humming that same low frequency as my anxiety. I felt like a ghost, haunting my own success. I'd sit in meetings, watching my mouth move, hearing my voice advocate for budget increases and thinking, is this it? Is this the whole thing? I was checking boxes on a list I didn't remember writing. The terrifying part is that I thought I was content. I looked at my friends dealing with messy divorces, with loud arguments, with financial instability, and I felt superior. I thought I had solved the equation. I mistook safety for satisfaction. I didn't realize that you can suffocate in a room full of fresh air if your lungs just stop taking it in. I wore the good wife and successful career woman labels like armor. They protected me from asking the dangerous questions. Questions like, when was the last time your heart raced? Or when was the last time someone looked at you and really saw you? I buried those questions under quarterly reports and PTA meetings. I drowned them in the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator and the white noise of a life that worked on paper. But biology teaches us that sterile environments are fragile. One foreign agent, one breach in the containment protocol, and the whole system reacts. You can only suppress a variable for so long before it demands to be factored in. I thought the variable was stress, or maybe a midlife crisis. I thought I just needed a vacation or a new hobby. I didn't realize the disruption was already sitting at my dinner table, pouring wine and laughing a little too loud. I didn't realize the breach wasn't a what, it was a who. Adeline is the variable I never accounted for. If my life is a sterile, climate-controlled lab, Adeline is a wildfire. She is vivid, messy, and unapologetically loud. She works as an executive chef at a bistro downtown, a place that perpetually smells of roasted garlic, reduction sauces, and high-stakes sweat. Her hands, those hands, are usually stained with turmeric or beet juice, scarred from oven burns and knife slips. They are working hands, rough and capable. While my days are spent in the hermetically sealed silence of a clean room, hers are spent in the roar of a kitchen, shouting orders, tasting sauces with a finger, living in a world of sensory overload. When I walk into her apartment, my shoulders drop 3 inches. It's biological. My cortisol levels plummet the moment I smell her perfume, sandalwood and something smoky, like burnt sugar. She is the oxygen tank I didn't know I was wearing. We've been best friends for 12 years, traversing that specific, intense landscape of female friendship that sits right on the border of romance without ever crossing it. We have the kind of bond that people call sisterly, which is the greatest lie women tell themselves to avoid looking at the truth. We are the partners who aren't partners. We've traveled to Napa and shared a king bed because it's just easier. We've held hands walking through crowded street fairs, fingers interlaced, because we didn't want to get separated. I have let her zip up my dresses, her knuckles grazing my spine, and told myself the shiver was just the cold. I have let her tuck hair behind my ear, her thumb lingering on my cheekbone, and told myself it was maternal. There was always a density to the air around her. In physics, we talk about gravitational wells, objects with enough mass that they bend space-time around them. Adeline is a gravitational well. When she's in the room, I am oriented toward her. It's not a choice, it's physics. At parties, I track her location like a radar. If she's laughing in the kitchen, I find a reason to need water. If she's on the balcony, I suddenly need fresh air. I told myself this was just loyalty. I told myself I just liked her company. I didn't admit that I was starving, and she was the only food source in a famine I hadn't acknowledged. And the touching. God, the touching. It's so easy for women to touch without consequence. The plausible deniability of female intimacy is a dangerous thing. A hand on the thigh during a funny movie, a head resting on a shoulder in a cab. With Adeline, these weren't just gestures. They were transfers of energy. I would feel the heat of her palm on my arm for hours after she let go. I treated those moments like rare data points, anomalies in my otherwise flat-lined emotional landscape. I cataloged them, analyzed them, and then filed them away under friendship, ignoring the fact that the file was bursting at the seams. It started as a Tuesday. Just a Tuesday. The kind of day that is usually erased from memory by Wednesday morning. Marcus was at a conference in Chicago. The kids were at a sleepaway camp for the week, a rare, silent interval in the house. I had finished a grant proposal and felt that hollow, vibrating exhaustion that comes after mental marathons. I didn't want to go home to the empty, echoey house. I didn't want to eat a salad standing over the sink while scrolling through emails. I texted her. Wine? She replied in 30 seconds. Door is open. I'm making risotto. Come get fed. Come get fed. That was Adeline. She fed me. Not just food, but attention, color, noise. I drove to her place, the city lights blurring in the rain, feeling that familiar pull in my chest. The closer I got to her zip code, the more awake I felt. It was as if I was driving out of a fog bank and into high definition. I parked the car, checked my lipstick in the rearview mirror, a vanity I never bothered with for Marcus, and walked up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. I didn't know I was walking toward a demolition. I thought I was just going for dinner. Stepping into Adeline's apartment was like walking into a living organism. My house is a series of surfaces to be wiped down. Hers is a collection of textures to be felt. The air was thick with the scent of brown butter, fried sage, and the metallic tang of open rain hitting the fire escape. It smelled like sustenance. While my home is curated in shades of ice and stone, Adeline lives in amber and ochre. There were books stacked in precarious towers against the exposed brick, their spines broken and loved. There were half-finished canvases leaning against the wall, smelling of turpentine and linseed oil. It was chaotic, yes, but it was the chaos of creation, not destruction. It felt vibrantly, unapologetically alive. She poured the wine before I even had my coat off. A dark, heavy Malbec that coated the glass like ink. "You look like you've been holding your breath for 6 hours," she said, handing me the glass. Her fingers brushed mine, a casual, grazing contact that sent a static shock straight up my radial nerve. I laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in the humid air of her kitchen. I told her she was right. I drank. The wine was bold, tannic, and grounding. It tasted like earth and fruit, a stark contrast to the crisp, watery whites Marcus preferred. We ate the risotto sitting on the floor by her coffee table, the way we did when we were 25 and couldn't afford furniture. But we weren't 25 anymore. We were 38, and the floor felt harder, but the intimacy felt heavier. The rain lashed against the windows, sealing us inside a private capsule of warm light and jazz that hummed low from her vintage speakers. The conversation started in the safe zones, the grant proposal, her sous chef's incompetence, the weather. But as the bottle emptied, the tide of the evening began to turn. The safe, shallow waters of our usual banter receded, leaving us stranded on the rocky, exposed shore of something real. We moved to the sofa, a crushed velvet thing in a deep, bruised purple that swallowed you whole. I sat in the corner, she sprawled on the other end, her legs tucked under her. But the distance between us, usually a safe 3 feet of cushion, felt charged. It wasn't empty space anymore. It was a magnetic field. The lighting in the room had shifted with the hour, the overheads off, leaving only the floor lamps casting long, fluid shadows that danced across the walls. "Are you happy, though?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry, delivered with her head tilted back against the cushions, her eyes tracing the ceiling. "I'm successful," I answered automatically. It was my programmed response. That wasn't the question. She turned her head, and the movement was slow, aquatic. The air in the room seemed to thicken, increasing in viscosity until it felt like we were moving through syrup. The jazz track changed to something with a heavy, dragging bass line that seemed to sync with the sudden, heavy thud of my heart. I looked at her. I really looked at her. Usually, I filter Adeline through the lens of friend. I see the whole picture. The outfit, the hair, the presence. I don't let myself focus on the macro details. But tonight, the filter dissolved. I watched the way her throat moved when she swallowed more wine. I traced the sharp, elegant line of her clavicle, exposed by the loose collar of her silk shirt. I noticed a small mole near her ear that I had seen 1,000 times, but never cataloged. My gaze felt heavy, physical, as if my eyes were touching her. I should have looked away. The protocol for platonic best friend dictates that you look at the eyes, or the hands, or the space just past their shoulder. You do not stare at the pulse jumping in the hollow of their throat. You do not wonder how the skin there would taste. But the wine had eroded my protocols. The silence stretched between us, not awkward, but coiled. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a wire pulled tight enough to hum. I realized, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that I wasn't just observing her, I was drinking her in. The room felt too small, or maybe I had just become too big for the space I was allowing myself to occupy. The safety of the evening was gone, replaced by a dangerous, thrilling gravity. We were no longer just two friends catching up. We were two bodies in a room where the oxygen was rapidly running out. And for the first time in a decade, I didn't want to open a window. I wanted to see what would happen if we suffocated. The physics of the room changed first. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a gradual, terrifying realignment of gravity. We had been sitting on opposite ends of that crushed velvet sofa, separated by a cushion that served as a demilitarized zone. But as the conversation drifted from the safe harbors of work and weather into the deeper waters of ambition and regret, that distance began to collapse. Adeline shifted. It was a small movement, a readjustment of her posture, tucking one leg further beneath her. But it brought her knee into contact with my thigh. In any other year, in any other version of this friendship, one of us would have pulled back. We would have muttered a quick, "sorry," and reestablished the perimeter. That is the protocol. That is how you maintain the lie. But tonight, neither of us moved. Her knee rested against the side of my thigh, a point of contact no larger than a silver dollar, but it burned with the intensity of a soldering iron. The denim of my jeans and the silk of her trousers were the only things separating us, and they felt impossibly thin. I stopped breathing for a count of 3, waiting for her to retreat. She didn't. Instead, she leaned into it, a subtle increase in pressure that felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. I tried to focus on what she was saying, something about the texture of a sauce she was developing, about the balance of acid and fat. But my brain had abandoned language processing to focus entirely on the nerve endings in my leg. The heat from her body was seeping into mine, a slow, steady transfusion of energy that made my pulse hammer in my throat. I took a sip of wine, my hand trembling just enough that the liquid tilted dangerously against the rim. I was terrified. I was exhilarated. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath my toes, and realizing I had no desire to step back. Then came the hand. She was emphasizing a point, her voice dropping an octave, becoming richer, more resonant. "You treat your life like a checklist, darling," she said, the endearment slipping out with a casual ease that wrecked me. She reached out and placed her hand on my forearm. It wasn't a tap. It wasn't a pat. It was a grip. Her fingers wrapped around my wrist, her thumb resting against the pulse point that was currently betraying me with its frantic rhythm. Her skin was warm, dry, and calloused from the kitchen, rough pads of fingertips that felt incredibly grounding against my smooth, office-softened skin. She didn't let go. She held my arm as if she were checking for a structural weakness, or perhaps creating one. And then, she stopped looking at the room. For years, Adeline and I have engaged in a visual dance of avoidance. We look at each other, but we don't look. We focus on the mouth when the other is speaking, or the eyebrows, or the hairline. We avoid direct eye contact during moments of high emotion because eye contact is intimate. Eye contact is raw. Tonight, she broke the rule. She turned her head and locked her eyes onto mine with a weight that felt physical. It was an unflinching gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't smile to soften the intensity. She just looked at me, stripping away the layers of best friend and wife and mother, until she was looking at the creature underneath. Her eyes were dark, dilated in the low light, and absolutely clear. And that was the most terrifying part. She wasn't drunk. She was loose, yes. The wine had lowered the drawbridge, but the person walking across it was entirely lucid. She knew exactly where her hand was. She knew exactly how her knee was pressing against mine. She was operating with the precise, dangerous intent of a predator who has decided to stop hiding in the tall grass. I felt a magnetic pull so strong it made me dizzy. It was a biological imperative, a command written in a language my body remembered, even if my mind had forgotten it. I wanted to lean forward. The distance between our faces was perhaps 18 inches, but it felt like a canyon I was desperate to jump. I saw the tiny golden flecks in her irises. I saw the way her pupils had swallowed the brown, leaving only a thin ring of color. I saw the knowledge in her face. She knew I was terrified, and she knew I wanted this. The silence that fell between us was heavy, pregnant with things that had been unsaid for a decade. It wasn't the comfortable silence of companionship. It was the thick, static, charged silence of a storm about to break. The jazz music seemed to fade into the background, becoming nothing more than a distant hum. The only sound I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the steady, deliberate intake of her breath. She was waiting. She was giving me a chance to pull away, to laugh it off, to reestablish the boundaries of our safe, sterile world. But I was frozen, pinned to the spot by the weight of her hand on my arm and the heat of her gaze. I was a scientist watching an experiment go critical, knowing I should hit the emergency stop, but unable to tear my eyes away from the beautiful, catastrophic reaction unfolding before me. The volume of the world didn't just lower. It vanished. The rain against the glass, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren. Everything was scrubbed from the audio track until the only sound remaining was the wet, heavy thud of my own pulse against my eardrum. Adeline didn't move her hand from my arm. In fact, her grip tightened, just a fraction, a microscopic increase in pressure that told me she was anchoring herself as much as she was holding me. She leaned in. The movement was slow, deliberate, stripping away the last few inches of plausible deniability. I could smell the oak in the line on her breath, mixed with that smoky, burnt sugar perfume. Her eyes dropped from mine, lowering to look at my hands, which were currently clenched into white-knuckled fists in my lap. She studied them with the intensity of an art appraiser looking for a forgery, or perhaps a scientist looking for a cure. "I've been thinking about this," she said. Her voice had dropped to a register I had never heard before, a low, granular murmur that bypasses the ears and vibrates directly in the chest cavity. It wasn't the boisterous voice of the chef shouting orders. It was the quiet, terrifying voice of a woman stating a fact she could no longer suppress. About what? My voice was a dry husk. I barely recognized it. She traced the tendon on the back of my hand with her thumb. About the way you move. About how careful you are with everything. She paused, and the air between us seemed to crystallize. Then she looked back up, locking her eyes onto mine with that terrifying clarity. "I want to see your hands on me, Clara. I want to know what your hands feel like on my skin." The sentence hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a visceral, biological command. The world stopped. I mean that literally. For a split second, my brain ceased to process visual input. There was just the echo of her words bouncing around the inside of my skull. "I want to see your hands on me." My guard didn't just drop, it disintegrated. The carefully constructed firewall I had built over 15 years, the protocols of wife, mother, professional, straight woman, vanished in the heat of that single sentence. A rush of adrenaline flooded my system, cold and sharp, followed immediately by a wave of heat so intense I thought I might actually be running a fever. It was a physiological override. My lungs forgot the rhythm of breathing. My stomach dropped as if I were in a free-falling elevator. I looked down at my hands. They looked foreign. These were the hands that typed grant proposals. These were the hands that folded Marcus's shirts and packed school lunches and steered the Audi through morning traffic. They were instrumental, efficient, sterile tools of a well-managed life. But under Adeline's gaze, they transformed. I suddenly saw them as she must be seeing them, as instruments of touch, of pressure, of pleasure. I could feel a phantom sensation on my fingertips, a tingling anticipation of texture and warmth that I hadn't given permission to exist. The silence that followed was heavy, dense with the reality of what had just happened. There is a concept in physics called entropy, the idea that once a system moves from order to disorder, it can never go back. You cannot unscramble an egg. You cannot unspill wine. And I knew, with a terrifying, absolute certainty, that I could never unhear those words. The seal was broken. The safe, hermetically sealed container of our friendship had been breached, and the atmosphere rushing in was toxic to the life I had left back in the suburbs. I should have been horrified. That is the correct reaction for a married woman. I should have felt offended or confused or defensive. But the horror wasn't there. What was there, sitting heavy and hot in the pit of my stomach, was recognition. It was a deep, resonant yes that terrified me more than any rejection could have. I realized that I didn't just want to hear her say it. I wanted to do it. I wanted to reach out across those few inches of velvet sofa and map the line of her jaw, to feel the pulse in her neck, to learn the topography of her skin with the same rigorous attention I applied to everything else in my life. The air in the room was now fully charged. Dangerous. Adeline didn't pull back. She didn't laugh it off or say, "I'm just kidding." She sat there, exposed and brave, waiting to see if I would run or if I would finally, after 12 years of sleepwalking, wake up. The desire was a tangible thing in the room, a third presence on the sofa with us, demanding to be acknowledged. I was standing on the precipice of my own life, looking down into the dark water, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking about the fall. I was thinking about the jump. I can't. The words tore out of my throat, jagged and panicked. It wasn't a decision. It was a reflex. The same survival instinct that makes you yank your hand back from a hot stove kicked in, overriding the part of me that wanted to burn. I scrambled back against the velvet cushions, putting a foot of dead space between us. The loss of her heat was immediate, a physical drop in temperature that made me shiver. I started throwing up barriers, clumsy verbal sandbags to hold back the flood. "It's late. Marcus is waiting. I have a board meeting at 8. The excuses tumbled out, sounding thin and ridiculous in the heavy, charged air of her living room. I was lying, and we both knew it. Marcus wasn't waiting. He was asleep. The meeting wasn't until 10. But I needed the structure of my other life, the rigid scaffolding of my obligations, to keep me from collapsing into her. Adeline didn't try to stop me. She didn't reach out again. She just sat there, her hand resting on her own knee now, watching me with that calm, terrifying patience. She looked like someone who had just placed a bet she knew she would eventually win. "Drive safe, Clara," she said softly. No apology, no forget I said that. Just a dismissal that felt like a promise. I fled. I grabbed my coat and purse with fumbling fingers and practically ran for the door. The click of the latch behind me sounded like a gunshot. I took the stairs 2 at a time, desperate to get to the street, to the cold air, to the safety of my car. Inside the Audi, the silence was hermetic. I gripped the steering wheel, and that's when I felt it, the charge. My hands were shaking, vibrating against the leather at a frequency that felt dangerous. I looked at them in the glow of the dashboard lights. They looked the same, manicured nails, the gold wedding band glinting mockingly on my ring finger, but they felt foreign. They felt like they had been conscripted. "I want to see your hands on me." The sentence replayed in my head, not as a memory, but as a sensation. My palms burned, my fingertips tingled. It was as if her desire had coated them in an invisible substance I couldn't wash off. Every time I shifted gears, every time I signaled a turn, I was hyper-aware of the skin, the muscle, the bone. My hands were no longer tools for typing or cleaning. They were potential instruments of something else entirely. The drive home was a blur of highway lights and panic. I was moving from the technicolor intensity of Adeline's world back into the monochrome safety of my own, but the transition felt violent. I pulled into the driveway of my house, that perfect, symmetrical colonial with its manicured hedges and motion sensor lights. It looked like a stage set. It looked like a model home where no one actually lived. I entered through the garage, punching in the security code with fingers that felt too clumsy for the keypad. The house was silent, breathing that dry, filtered air of the HVAC system. It smelled of lemon polish and nothingness. I walked through the kitchen, past the gleaming appliances, past the calendar on the fridge marked with soccer practices and dental appointments. I felt like an intruder. I felt like a spy carrying state secrets in her chest cavity. Upstairs, the master bedroom was a study in peaceful hues. Marcus was asleep, his breathing a steady, rhythmic rasp that usually comforted me. Tonight, it sounded like an accusation. I stood by the side of the bed, looking down at him. He was a good man. He was safe. He was everything I had promised to want. And standing there, with the ghost of Adeline's touch still burning on my arm, I felt a wave of guilt so nausea-inducing I had to grip the dresser for support. I went into the bathroom and scrubbed my hands. I used the exfoliating soap, the hot water, scrubbing until the skin was pink and raw. But the sensation remained. The phantom weight of her request was heavier than the water. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked terrified, her pupils blown wide, her chest rising and falling too fast. I didn't recognize her. I slid into bed next to Marcus, keeping to my edge of the mattress, careful not to let even a toe brush against him. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling shadows, and realized the terrifying truth. I had left her apartment, but I hadn't escaped. The words were inside the house now. The desire was in the bed with me. The seal on my hermetically preserved life hadn't just cracked. It had shattered. And no amount of scrubbing was going to make my hands feel innocent again. The simulation of normalcy I attempted to run was glitching from the moment I woke up the next morning. I went to the lab. I put on the white coat. I stood in front of the flow hood, my hands encased in blue nitrile gloves, performing the same pipetting motions I have performed for 15 years. But the precision was gone. I stared at the clear liquid in the vial and saw nothing but the dark, dilated pupils of Adeline's eyes. My colleague, David, asked me about the efficacy data on the new trial, and I had to ask him to repeat the question 3 times. I felt like I was operating a machine from a great distance, pulling levers and pushing buttons, but the connection was severed. The air in the lab, usually crisp and filtered, felt thin, insufficient to fill my lungs. I was going through the motions of a career I had spent decades building, but I felt like a fraud in my own skin. Returning home was worse. Entering my house felt like walking into a museum exhibit of a life, rather than a life itself. The foyer was too quiet. The living room pillows were chopped and fluffed to an unnatural perfection. I looked at the family photos on the mantle. Marcus, the kids, me, and they looked like stock photography that came with the frames. I felt a profound sense of imposter syndrome, not in my career, but in my own kitchen. I stood by the island, gripping the cool granite, waiting for the feeling of belonging to return. It didn't. The walls seemed to lean away from me, rejecting me before I could reject them. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was judgmental. It demanded a version of Clara that I wasn't sure I could locate anymore. Dinner was an exercise in sensory deprivation. Marcus sat across from me, dissecting a chicken breast with the same methodical calm he applied to his portfolio. He talked about the landscaping quote, about the neighbor's new fence. His voice was a steady, low drone that usually signaled safety. Now, it sounded like static. Then he reached out. He covered my hand with his. It was a gesture of comfort, of partnership, but his skin felt dry. It felt like paper. It felt like sand. There was no charge, no current, just the friction of two dry surfaces meeting. I had to concentrate on every muscle in my arm to keep from pulling away. It wasn't that I was repulsed by him. It was that I was suddenly, violently aware of the absence of what I actually wanted. His touch was a statement of fact. Adeline's touch had been a question. The obsession took root in the silence of that house. The phrase didn't just repeat in my mind. It colonized it. I want to see your hands on me. It played on a loop, overlaying every mundane task. I folded laundry, and the warm cotton became the heat of her skin. I gripped the steering wheel, and the leather became the curve of her waist. My hands felt permanently charged, humming with a phantom potential energy. I found myself staring at them constantly, in the shower, at stoplights, during conference calls. I flexed my fingers, watching the tendons move, wondering how they would look against the hollow of her throat. I was haunted not by a ghost, but by a possibility. Then came the digital intrusion. Thursday afternoon. My phone buzzed against the mahogany of the conference table. A single word from Adeline. Coffee? It was neutral, plausible, the kind of text friends send 100 times a year. But on the screen, it pulsed like a warning light. It wasn't about coffee. It was a probe. It was a check to see if the line was still live. I stared at the letters until they blurred. The text sat there, heavy and demanding. It forced me to acknowledge that she was waiting, that the moment on the sofa wasn't a hallucination I could blink away. It was real, and it was waiting for an answer. That night, I sat in the bathtub until the water turned cold, staring at the tiles, and finally stopped lying to myself. I had spent months calling this feeling restlessness. I had categorized it as burnout, as a midlife slump, as a need for a vacation. I had pathologized my unhappiness to avoid naming it. But looking at the water still on my skin, I realized the diagnosis was wrong. I wasn't bored. I wasn't stressed. I was starving. The good life I had built wasn't failing because of a structural error. It was failing because it was built for a woman who didn't exist. I wasn't a straight woman having a crisis. I was a woman who had finally, after decades of holding her breath, realized she was suffocating. The architecture hadn't crumbled. I had simply outgrown the cage. The breaking point wasn't cinematic. It didn't happen during a storm or a screaming match. It happened over a plate of roasted salmon on a Saturday night. We were hosting the Davises, neighbors we've known since the kids were in preschool. The conversation looped through the usual circuit: property taxes, the new magnet school, the merits of hybrid SUVs. Ben Davis was telling a long story about a contractor, and everyone was laughing. I opened my mouth to contribute the expected chuckle, the socially appropriate noise of agreement, and found that my throat had physically closed. I sat there, gripping the stem of my wine glass until my knuckles turned white, watching Marcus nod at Ben's story. He looked so comfortable. He fit into this scene, the candlelight, the linen napkins, the easy banter, like a puzzle piece finding its home. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water dumped down my spine, that I was a foreign object. I was a contaminant in my own life. If I stayed in this chair, playing this role for one more hour, I would simply dissolve. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. I need to check the dessert, I said, my voice sounding thin and tinny. I walked into the kitchen, leaned against the cold granite island, that dead stone, and tried to breathe. But the air in the house felt recycled. It felt used. When the Davises finally left, the silence that rushed back into the house was heavy. Marcus began stacking plates with his usual efficiency. "Good night," he said, not looking up. "Ben is funny." "I can't do this anymore, Marcus." He stopped. The plate in his hand hovered inches above the stack. He turned slowly, his brow furrowed. "Do what? The hosting? We can take a break for a while." "No," I said, the word trembling. "This. Us. Me." We sat on the beige living room sofa, the same place where we watched Netflix and planned vacations. I told him. I didn't tell him about Adeline's hands. Not yet. That felt like a private reverence he didn't have the clearance to access. Instead, I told him about the vacuum. I told him that I had been sleepwalking for 15 years and that I had woken up screaming inside my own head. "Is there someone else?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, it was baffled. He was trying the solve for X. "It's not about someone else taking me away," I said, and I meant it. "It's about me needing to inhabit my own body. I feel like I'm haunting this house, Marcus. I'm not living in it. I am starving in a room full of food." He looked at me. Really looked at me. And I saw the moment the data settled. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. He just looked incredibly tired, like a structure that had been bearing too much weight for too long. "You've been gone for a long time, haven't you?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I whispered. "I'm sorry." Packing was a blur of sensory details. The rasp of the zipper on my weekender bag sounded like a tear in the fabric of the universe. The soft thud of clothes being thrown in without folding. I didn't take much. Essentials. Jeans, a thick sweater, the notebook I keep in my bedside drawer. I walked through the bedroom, touching nothing. I felt like I was evacuating a disaster zone, leaving behind the wreckage of a life that had looked perfect from the outside, but had been structurally unsound for years. I walked down the stairs. The house was dark now. Marcus was sitting in the kitchen, staring at the unwashed dishes. I wanted to say something profound, something that would explain the magnitude of the shift. But there were no words for the tectonic plate movement of a woman deciding to save her own life. "I'll call you," I said. He nodded, not turning around. I walked out the front door. The night air hit me like a physical blow. Cold, sharp, unfiltered. It smelled of damp earth and freedom. My hands, gripping the handle of my bag, weren't shaking anymore. They felt steady. They felt capable. I got into the car, the engine roaring to life, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't check the rearview mirror. I didn't look back at the house, at the windows, at the life I was leaving. I put the car in gear and drove toward the city, toward the smell of burnt sugar and rain, toward the only place where the oxygen levels were high enough to keep me alive. I wasn't driving to an affair. I was driving toward the first honest breath I was ever going to take. The hallway smelled of floor wax and old dust, a stark institutional scent that felt miles away from the manicured potpourri of the suburbs. It was 9:15 p.m. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't running on the frantic energy of a panic attack anymore. I was operating with the cold, terrifying clarity of a person who has just cut the brake lines and steered into the skid. I knocked. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the wood that echoed in the stairwell. The door opened. Adeline stood there, in oversized sweatpants and a t-shirt stained with charcoal, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. She wasn't expecting company. Her face shifted through a complex algorithm of emotions, confusion, then a sudden, sharp wariness. She didn't step back to let me in. She stood in the threshold, a gatekeeper protecting her own peace from the hurricane she thought I still was. "Clara?" Her voice was guarded. She thought I was here to apologize. She thought I was here to patch the leak and go back to the ship. "I left," I said. The words felt solid, heavy as stones in my mouth. She blinked. her hand tightening on the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. You left the house? I left the marriage, I corrected. I told him, it's over. The air between us changed. The wariness didn't vanish, but the tension shifted from defensive to suspended. Clara, you didn't have to. I didn't do it for you, I said, stepping closer, invading the space she was trying to hold. I did it for me. I couldn't breathe there. But now that I've done it, I'm here. She stepped back then, opening the channel. I walked in. The apartment smelled the same, turpentine, spices, and rain. But the context had rotated 18 degrees. It wasn't a hideout anymore. It was the only ground left. I dropped my bag on the floor. The sound was final. I'm sober, I said, holding her gaze. I'm terrified, but I'm here. Adeline looked at me, searching my face for the cracks, for the regret that usually follows the destruction of a decade. She found none. She let out a breath she must have been holding for days. Okay, she whispered. Okay. I didn't wait for a better invitation. I crossed the distance. I raised my hands, those shaking, terrified, liberated hands. And I did exactly what she had asked. I placed my palms on her face. The contact was electric, immediate, and devastatingly real. My thumbs rested against the high curve of her cheekbones, my fingers tangled in the loose hair at her temples. Her skin was warm, yielding slightly under the pressure of my grip. It wasn't a phantom sensation anymore. It was physics. It was biology. It was the data point I had been missing for my entire adult life. She closed her eyes, leaning into my touch with a sound that was half sob, half exhale. I traced the line of her jaw, my fingers engaging with the reality of her bone structure. I moved my hands down, feeling the strong, frantic pulse of her carotid artery, mapping the tension in her neck. I wasn't just touching her. I was grounding myself. I was planting a flag in the new world. Clara, she breathed, her eyes flying open. They were dark, wrecked, and beautiful. I'm here, I said again, anchoring us both. I pulled her in. The kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It tasted of salt and relief and the specific, smoky chemistry that belongs only to her. But the focus remained on my hands, one sliding down to press flat against the small of her back, the other gripping her shoulder, pulling her flush against me until there was no air left between us. I felt heavy. I felt gravity. I felt like I had finally, after a lifetime of orbiting, crashed into the earth. The morning light hits the brick wall differently than it hits beige drywall. It's harsher, but it's real. I am drinking coffee from a chipped mug, watching Adeline sleep, and the silence in the room isn't empty. It's full. The fear is still there, sitting in the corner, but it's small compared to the massive, fragile power of having nothing left to hide. My hands are steady on the ceramic. They finally belong to me. If you've ever had to burn down a safe life to find a true one, subscribe and share your story.